Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. As of May 23rd, 110 statewide ballot measures have been certified for the ballot in 35 states for elections this year. In even-numbered years since 2010, the average was 161 statewide ballot measures. Today, I'm joined by the managing editor of the Ballot Measures team, Ryan Byrne, also known as my boss, to talk our favorite subject, ballot measures. We still have a little over a month until most legislative sessions will come to a close, and citizen initiative signature deadlines are approaching this summer, so statewide ballots are nowhere near finalized, but we're going to discuss today some of the trends we're starting to see emerge this year. So Ryan, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me.
I know this is our favorite topic, but I think that there's a lot of interesting things on the ballot this year that will make some waves in the headlines for sure. So the first thing that comes to mind for me, Ryan, is that we seem like we might be on track for more ballot measures than we've seen in the last 6 even-year election cycles. We've been very busy with certification. So is that what you're expecting as well?
Yeah, we're definitely trending above the average for the past decade. And I think this year we could potentially actually have the most for the past decade based on weekly averages, which, it's still hard to project. But if everything was to follow trends from the averages from prior years, we would expect between 165 and 170 for this year, which would be quite a number compared to the past couple of election cycles. Like you said, we have several months to go. A lot can change based on how signature verifications go for the citizen-initiated measures, what actions legislatures take on amendments. And typically this time of year is the busiest. So if we look at those 2-year election cycles, the June before the general election is generally the busiest month. So as we head into June, we're likely to see a lot more ballot measure certifications. In fact, on average, in June, there's 20 state ballot measure certifications. So if we've been busy, it's going to get busier. In July and August, slow down a little bit, but we still tend to have about 15 during each month before it really trickles off the first week of September as ballots are finalized. So what's going to happen this year? I think, June will really paint a fuller picture for us as in terms of whether we're trending above the average or we're going to be more on par with historical trends. But I think one thing we can say based on what we're observing so far is that it's very unlikely to be a below average year in terms of the number of ballot measures.
Well, I guess it's always good to be busy. Like I said at the top of the episode, we're going to walk through ballot measure trends in this episode. And we're going to start with the one that's taking up the most air in the room, abortion. So following the Dobbs decision, we've seen an uptick in abortion-related ballot measures. Are we going to continue to see as many as we saw in 2022, which had the highest, or what are these measures addressing and how are they getting on the ballot?
Yeah, I think abortion is definitely a major issue still, and I think it probably will be for at least a few years or a few election cycles. So the number hasn't surpassed those in 2022 yet, but it is likely that it will. So since Dobbs, which, as people know, shifted abortion regulations to the states, people have been paying more attention to abortion-related ballot measures since that is a state process. But, I think abortion has been a really persistent topic for ballot measures since the 1970s. The big difference now is who's behind the initiatives, what are the initiatives attempting to do? So in 2022, the measures were actually evenly split between campaigns that people would generally describe as pro-choice or pro-reproductive rights, and the other half by campaigns that people would generally describe as pro-life groups. Before 2022, it was actually overwhelmingly the pro-life camp that used ballot initiatives to pursue policy objectives. And now what's interesting this year is that trend has seemingly completely reversed. 2024 is already notable for having the most ballot measures backed by pro-choice campaigns in history. And so far, although there are some that are proposed, but so far in terms of ballot measure certifications, there are none backed by pro-life groups that have made the ballot. So overall, similar policy objective in terms of these initiatives that we're seeing, which is to establish an explicit state constitutional right to abortion.
And do you know off the top of your head the proportion of initiatives to referrals related to abortion? I feel like this year it's more initiatives than referrals compared to 2022.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So far we have 4 certified, and 3 of them are initiatives, and 1 is a referral.
Interesting.
There are lots of other ones pending, a lot more initiatives. There's this one in New York that is a referral that got thrown off the ballot by a judge, but it was a mid-level court. So it's on appeal to the state's highest court, which is not called the Supreme Court in New York, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah, so we may see that back on that ballot, which will be interesting if it...
Yeah, I think there's a good chance of that it's going to end back up on the ballot.
Another topic we've seen trending recently is electoral reform, in particular changes to the electoral system like ranked choice voting and top 2 primaries. Where can voters expect to see this topic on the ballot this year?
Right. Ranked choice voting is on the ballot in Oregon and Nevada. So in Oregon, the measure is to adopt RCV. Nevada is a little different. It's RCV for general elections, but the primaries would use a top 5 system. So everyone runs in the same primary, regardless of their party affiliation, Democrats, Republicans, third parties, independents, libertarians, everyone running in one primary. And the top 5 vote getters would move on to the general election, where ranked choice voting would be used. So this is really similar to Alaska's top 4 primaries, which they also use with ranked choice voting in general elections, but instead of top 4, it's top 5. Nevada is also interesting because it's the only state where voters need to approve citizen-initiated constitutional amendments twice. So voters have actually already approved it once, though it wasn't necessarily a huge margin. It was 53% voted yes. So we'll see how that plays out. With this requirement of voting on it twice, we have very much seen initiatives in Nevada have sizable victories the first time and then get defeated the second time. So we'll see how it goes. Voters in Idaho could also see a top 4 ranked choice voting initiative. Signatures have been submitted there. Somewhat related in the electoral system realm, but not RCV. In South Dakota, voters will decide on top 2 primaries. So we're talking about top 5, top 4, top 2. No RCV in this case. Top 2 is used in Washington and California for federal elections as well. Now, on the other side, this is the first election year where we're not just seeing these pro-RCV initiatives, initiatives to enact ranked choice voting. We're actually seeing ones that are kind of opposed to it. So in Alaska, voters will actually be voting on an initiative to repeal top 4 RCV, which, as I noted, they narrowly adopted in 2020. In Missouri, the legislature referred a constitutional amendment to voters that would prohibit ranked choice voting, as well as primary systems like top 2, top 4. Arizona, not ranked choice voting, but those primary systems, again, prohibiting top 2, top 4, and so on. So really, this is the first election in which we don't just see RCV proposals, but proposals to repeal it or ban enacting it by statute in the future.
An interesting note about that Missouri measure, which I'm personally covering, is that 9 states have already prohibited ranked choice voting via state statute, but Missouri would be the first to do it via constitutional amendment if it passes. It's kind of interesting. Related to electoral system changes, but in the way of suffrage or who can vote, this year's ballot will feature the highest number of only citizen voting ballot measures. So which states are voting on this policy and what are its implications, Ryan?
Yeah, so only citizen. So probably requires a little bit of explanation for some, or maybe everyone, because it's something that might seem kind of simple on the surface, but can have other implications. So many state constitutions say something along the lines of every citizen ... has a right to vote. Granted, there's usually something in there too about being 18 years old, but every citizen has a right to vote. What these amendments do is they tweak the language. So they replace the word every with only. So instead of every citizen has a right to vote, it's only a citizen has a right to vote. And we're going to see these on the ballot in Idaho, Iowa, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Wisconsin. There's several more that have been proposed. One in Arizona is making its way through the legislature. And just recently, one was introduced into the legislature in North Carolina. So we could still see it on a few more state ballots. Typically, these types of amendments are approved. There's been 6 of them since 2018. All of those ones received a fairly large margin. I think the lowest margin was actually in Colorado, where it still received 62% of the vote. So as these states change it from every citizen to only citizen, there's a bunch of debate as to what the implications are of that between supporters and opponents. But generally, there is one thing that they agree on, which is these amendments prohibit or preempt local governments from allowing non-citizens to vote. So federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections, but that law doesn't address state and local elections. And in fact, some towns and school districts in California, such as San Francisco and its school district, Maryland, Vermont, there are a few jurisdictions that do allow non-citizens to vote. So one practical implication of these amendments is that they would prohibit towns, school districts, so on, from allowing non-citizens to vote in the future.
And then not so much a trend. We're going to shift our focus to a specific state, California, which is always a buzz in the ballot measure world. So looking at California, what stuck out to you this election cycle?
That's a good question. There's a lot of interesting stuff on the ballot. I know there's some really notable conflicts that I've been discussing with you. So I'm going to turn it around to you after I give some updates, because I think you actually probably have some of the best insights. Because for people who don't know, Victoria is actually our California state ballot measure expert. So I'm going to save some of the really interesting big conflicts for her. But there's lots of interesting individual measures as well. $18 minimum wage, oil and gas well regulations, high school curriculums, and more. But I'm going to turn it back on trends rather than just focusing on California. So one that may seem less interesting only because I think people probably expect it to pass, but it is part of perhaps a developing trend. So the California state legislature referred a constitutional amendment to the ballot to repeal Proposition 8. So that's going back to 2008, perhaps one of California's most famous initiatives. Prop 8 defined marriages between one man and one woman. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down bans on same-sex marriage, but many states still have, really all the states except Nevada, who passed those bans by constitutional amendment, still have that language in their constitutions. So it's still in the books. California, it's still in the books. Constitution still says marriage is between one man and one woman. And, it would remain part of the Constitution unless voters repeal it. No practical implications in the near future, but if the Supreme Court did ever modify its prior ruling, these amendments could become active again, or at least in some form, right? And maybe not necessarily entirely, but in some way that would allow the state to, or require the state to enforce its provision. So California isn't the only state where voters will decide on these types of amendments, which are to repeal or redefine those marriage provisions. Voters in Hawaii and Colorado will also decide in November. And like I said, one state, Nevada, has already done this in 2020. But really, it's just Nevada so far. So this year, we'll be looking at California, Hawaii, and Colorado. So yeah, Victoria, I think, like I said, there's some big conflicts with campaigns and taxes and supermajority requirements. And I'm going to turn it around to you. So you, as our California expert, can kind of dive into those a little.
He uses expert lightly because this is only my second election cycle covering California, but there are definitely some interesting conflicts that have really caught my eye and make it very fun to cover California. So to start, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation has qualified a third ballot measure in 4 election cycles, aiming to repeal a state law that would limits local rent control. And its last 2 attempts in 2018 and 2020 were defeated. And the foundation contributed over $60 million for those 2 efforts and has already spent $11 million so far this election cycle on its 2024 effort. So that is on the ballot. There is a separate ballot initiative that would limit the AIDS Healthcare Foundation's ability to qualify future ballot initiatives. It doesn't outrightly say this, but the implications of the initiative would have that effect. The initiative is sponsored by the California Apartment Association and requires healthcare providers like the AIDS Healthcare Foundation to spend 98% of its revenues from federal discount prescription drug programs on direct patient care. And this would apply directly to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation as well as any other entities this may apply to, but it's really targeting the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And then a separate conflict that also has to deal with 2 separate ballot measures on the ballot in 2024 is between the California Business Roundtable and the state legislature. So the first one is an initiative sponsored by the California Business Roundtable. They are at least the biggest donor to this initiative that would enact or increase the vote thresholds for new state and local taxes. So Governor Newsom and several Democratic state legislators have filed a motion with the Supreme Court to try to get it removed, but that's still pending in the court. But the state legislature also has voted to refer a separate ballot measure to the 2024 ballot that would require initiatives that change vote thresholds to a supermajority to pass by that same supermajority requirement as is being proposed. And this measure includes a provision that would apply to measures on the ballot in 2024. So both of these measures are on the ballot and one would apply to one on the ballot. Kind of confusing. But since the Roundtable Initiative proposes a 2/3 supermajority for new taxes, it would have to pass by that threshold to be enacted. So it'll be interesting to see how that conflict plays out.
I think something that's really interesting there is because, Ballotpedia covers election results too. And I think it's going to be kind of fun on election night to, basically be in a position where we can't really decide if one ballot measure passed until we know if another one passed, right?
That might be the first in our history, at least, covering ballot measures. Are there any other states that have been really interesting this year or particularly active?
Well, all of them, but I probably can't talk about all of them. They're all interesting to us. Here's a conflict that I think people might not be obvious. I think people who listen to this podcast have probably heard the term trifectas before and how trifectas often result in, more legislation by one party than another, which would just be, kind of logical, right? If Republicans control the state government, then you would have more bills that align with their perspectives or goals. It's actually one of the interesting things about ballot measures in legislatures is that it's actually divided governments that tend to have some of the most interesting constitutional amendments. And that's because constitutional amendments are really a legislative process in which the legislature passes them and then voters decide whether to ratify or reject them. The governor really doesn't play a role. So in states where the government's divided, take Arizona or Wisconsin, for instance, right? Both have Democratic governors, but Republicans control the state legislatures. So the legislatures, which in this case both are Republican controlled, may choose to put measures on the ballot because the governor would veto them, and they think their odds are better with voters than the governor. In Arizona, it was actually the case that a number of bills were passed last session that the governor vetoed, and now they're considering passing them again, but putting them on the ballot instead of sending them to the governor, where voters will decide on them. So in Arizona, the session's still ongoing. Like I said, a lot of these bills have been proposed to go on the ballot, but it is kind of a back and forth process between the House and Senate, even though both are controlled by Republicans. They're making various amendments to this process. And I think Wisconsin has passed a number of constitutional amendments this year, but they've spread them out across the year. We already saw 2 decided. 2 more will be decided in, I believe, August. And then another one in November. So, I want to say watch every state, but I think if you had to pick one that we haven't otherwise talked about until now, it would be Arizona, because of all those legislatively referred measures that could happen, as well as those likely citizen-initiated measures, such as a right to abortion initiative, which the campaign has already announced that it has exceeded the signature threshold, but it's going to keep collecting until that deadline to just keep padding those numbers.
Yeah, definitely one state to watch. As I mentioned at the top of this show, we've still got a month or so until most state legislatures wrap up their sessions. So what are we watching out for? Are there any ballot measures maybe in the pipeline that might make headlines, or a trend that might pick up steam?
Yeah, I'm going to return to California. So I think if you think of just thinking about potential ballot measures, ones that have not made the ballot yet, and what's just kind of getting like local media coverage, in California, there's a big one to watch that has submitted signatures, and they're kind of in the process of verifying them. But it would repeal and amend parts of Proposition 47, which if you're outside California, that might not mean much, but it was an initiative passed in 2014 that classified certain crimes as misdemeanors instead of felonies. This new initiative, which again has submitted signatures, and I just checked up on them a few hours ago, and it very much looks like they will meet that signature threshold. It would actually increase the penalties for drug crimes and theft. So reversing some of those objectives of Proposition 47. This conflict is largely related to discussions about crime. It's divided Democrats. Its financial backers include several large retailers, Walmart, Target, Home Depot. But, we might not see it on the ballot. There is some discussion of the legislature trying to seek a compromise with initiative proponents. That's something that can be done in California, where the legislature and initiative proponents kind of work together to come up with maybe something that is kind of a compromise or in between. And then initiative proponents can actually pull it. So we'll have to see how it develops over the course of the next month or so. In late June is generally when the ballot for initiatives is set in California. So the legislature and initiative proponents still have a month to go.
Yeah, that's definitely a conflict I'm closely watching. So definitely will be interesting to see how it gets resolved. That's all the questions I have for you today. Ryan, thanks for coming on the show and breaking down some of the trends that we're seeing in the ballot measure world.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm sure like you said, we still got plenty more to go.
Yeah, for sure. And for our listeners, you can learn more about ballot measure coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.